So a friend and colleague of ours at Integral Without Borders, Raul Aramayo, also recognized how the more conventional ways of addressing global issues is insufficient. And so he began to look at, well, what are other ways of working in this space? And he saw some promising approaches and started to piece them together into what is now the integral mapping process. What we start to see is that this approach isn't about rejecting those more conventional ways, but rather seeing what does serve us and including that as we transcend to something higher, to something more comprehensive. And so one example would be how we include Carol Weiss's theory of change. We see that most organizations have a theory of change, and they've identified a desired outcome, a mission statement, if you will, of how they want the world to be. And from that desired outcome, they work backwards and chart a path towards achieving it. And that is helpful, but it is insufficient. In this integral mapping approach, we bring in other ways of working, such as Peter Seng's systems theory. And Peter Seng describes what that is in a very succinct and helpful way when he says, system thinking is a discipline for seeing wholes rather than parts, for seeing patterns of change rather than static snapshots, and for understanding the subtle interconnectedness that gives living systems their unique character. For me, one of the key terms there is living systems. It's recognizing that all of this is alive, and the more mechanistic, life-sucking, if you will, approach cannot handle that interconnectedness of life. Also, we include Otto Scharmer's Theory U process, where, as you'll see when we move through the steps of the integral mapping process, that we begin by deconstructing our meaning-making patterns and the ways that we're making sense of our reality, arriving at the source of all of this and connecting to that deeper knowing and understanding, and then reconstructing a new story. And that deconstruction and reconstruction process of the stories that we are telling is crucial to engaging with this more VUCA nature of reality. And lastly, of course, we use Ken Wilber's integral theory, and specifically the 4 quadrants that you'll see as we move through this course, holding both the interior and exterior dimensions of our individual and collective selves, and using that map to more comprehensively organize and understand and see how we are perceiving the world. So here's what to look forward to in this integral mapping process. This week you will be defining your field of work. You'll be connecting to your purpose, discovering where your focus area will be, and starting that deconstruction of your sense making. What assumptions are you telling, and how are those assumptions influencing what you do and do not do? So from there, we then identify the driving forces in that field of work. Using the 4 quadrants, we identify what is driving this forward, or what might be impeding it. Once we've identified those forces, we then look at their relationships, and we analyze them through a sensitivity analysis. That allows us to then move forward and discover our zone of work, which comes as a result of mapping those relationships among those forces. From that zone of work, we start to systemically represent the landscape we are working in by drawing and visually representing how it's all fitting together. And then certain stories will emerge from that visual representation, and we begin to construct the story of the current situation. And from there, we sense into, well, what is the future that wants to emerge from this place, from the present moment? And we allow that future to meet us. And as we meet it, we then construct our change narrative. We construct the story that we want to enact and that wants to be enacted through us. And from that story, it then gives us a North Star, if you will, to create the impact chain, coming back to the theory of change and the more logic model approach. And we move backwards, sensing into how might that change happen? And how might we participate in that change? And then lastly, we identify, well, what does our participation look like? We design an action plan, we map out a series of activities and steps, if you will, that will then lead us towards enacting that story of change.